like I said, the rules are very sparsely written, and in some cases, that might not be. It might not be that it would introduce confusion, but in some cases it seems to. And even if you look at it, you're like, oh, okay, I see why that's not, you know, not a contradiction or not ambiguous, but in others there does seem to be room for a little bit more clarity. And I don't even remember it being handled in all of the like I did look through some of the examples in play for this. Now, it is possible that you might not want to explore or be able to explore in a system. And as long as you don't have a base in that system, you can do something else there. You can use your ships, if they're the right kind of ship, to do mining or research. It's a way to get money or tech chits in places where you couldn't explore normally. The problem with this is the places where you want your ships that aren't explorable are generally places where you have bases. You kind of want to defend your base. So you're not able to do either of those tasks where you have a base. And so what ends up happening is players end up not defending their bases where they might have done so had they been able to do the mining or research there. But instead going off to places where they can gain more tech chits by exploring. Now, mining might be worth it because money starts to get really, really tight. But when money starts to get tight, that's when players start engaging more in trying to use the trade system. Because they have ships that have higher cargo capacity than they can buy settlements for. So they start hauling cargo in addition to settlers and whatnot. At the end of your turn, or of the turn, because you're all sharing it, it's all interleaved, you can buy techs over on the tech tree, which works pretty much as one would expect. I'm not going to go into the specifics of it because there are some special situations there. Or you can buy these cards. And you need to have certain techs to buy the cards. So there's a barrier to entry with the cards. And you pay a premium for buying more of the same level card, which can be kind of a pain in the butt. I did find that it's hard to keep track of all the different technologies that are in play for all the different powers, and it wouldn't be terribly easy in an opposed game because the tech chart is this thing sitting, somewhere, right, that you have to constantly be checking, and your cards are in front of you. And much more problematic is if you want to pay attention to what capabilities someone else has, if you're worried about them. Like I said, one of the big aspects was, well, we'll get to that in a moment, was not being able to really tell who's doing well and whatnot. Now, let's see. I went with the less advanced campaign start, which is not in the game. Yeah. Let me hit the optional rules. Well, let me hit the different things in the economic phase. So there's roll initiative, discard escalation. We already kind of talked about that. Draw event, you pull a tile. It may be something that has to be resolved kind of like an anomaly and shows up on a specific location and gives an advantage to whoever resolves it. It may just be, an event that's affecting everyone in some other way. Earth production. You get the tech and the money from Earth, and that early in the game is your big production capability. That's the money you're going to have for ships. You build your ships, you send them out exploring, and then you're like, now I'm out of money for, who knows how long, but it could be like, I don't know, it could be close to twice the pile of economic chits, right? Because you could pull it on the first one, and it could come up again on the last chit of the next turn, and there's 7 of these chits, so we're talking like 13, 14 turns somewhere. I don't want to do the addition there. Base production. So for base production, you look at each place where you have settlers, like in a base, and they can produce based on one of the planets that they're on. And they can either produce tech or they can produce money. I found early in the game that I wanted tech. There's a lot of victory points for tech, or a lot of victory point penalties for techs not gotten. Techs that you get give you an advantage to moving forward. I didn't really explore too much people grabbing cash, although one player in the mid-game started grabbing cash because he had directives that told him to do that. It was an interesting option. It allowed him to build more ships, send out more settlers and stuff like that, and thus get better production off of later turns. Now, the bigger your bases are, they produce slightly more tech or slightly more money, but you're best off having a lot of different bases in different systems so that you can produce that baseline tech or money rather than the advantages for having large settlements. However, you're only allowed a certain amount of bases, and that increases over the course of the game, but it doesn't get very big. I think 6 is maybe the most that you have. And some people can only have 4 bases, so that's not too cool. There's the draw of trade goods, where you get a fistful of trade goods based on your faction and how far into the game you are, and then you place them, and they can only be placed on places where you have bases that produce that, or on Earth if Earth produces that stuff. That means you may have to discard some. Don't worry too much. You get $1 billion for each trade good. You can cash them in at any time for $1 billion, basically, except like when they're being attacked. Settlement, growth, and migration. So this is kind of a complex thing. Each system has a total population it can support per player. But that gets modified. The more players that are there, that total population gets dropped by 10. Different cards can change the amount of population that you can have on different kinds of systems. And if you are not at your maximum population, you get additional people. You get additional people, one, as long as you have any settlers there. Instead of that, it's 1 per 10 settlers you have there, plus then a die roll to see, let's say you have 12, you roll a die on a 1 or a 2, you get 2, otherwise you just get 1. And then in addition to that, you have to make a percentile roll on the habitability to see if it attracts migrants. And that also can be modified by a lot of the massive amounts of game state that are out there. Cards, titles, capabilities, all kind of stuff can do that for you. I want to get a special card that allows me to charge my battery without having to hit it regularly. So if a game ever comes with that, I will use that. Okay. What that means is if other players start clustering into the same system as you, you might very quickly run out of the capability to have a decent-sized population in your base there. This is something that went in conjunction with those anomalies where where I was finding too many anomalies in any given system. You're only supposed to have 1 per system. It started creating really desirable places to be, but maybe they weren't, because like 3 players would be in there, there'd be minus 20 to the population. You'd end up very quickly running out of population there. And in some of them, you would just get no growth. Terraforming and add worlds. Okay, add worlds is just a mechanical action. But terraforming, once you have a certain tech, or if you're the givers, you're able to you're able to flip counters over to a more valuable side, which has greater population limits, greater production capabilities. Not by a lot, a little bit of advances. And once it's on that level 2 side, with some exceptions, you can reach into the pool of worlds and grab. Do you just draw one? Yeah, you just draw one normally. There are advances that allow you to draw more than one. And try to get a higher population world. But you're limited to only 10 higher than the last printed value. And then that shows up at its level 1 side, and it can be improved to the level 2 side. And then once again, it can be terraformed again to another type of world. This can be really weird because you could take away a type of planet that somebody really wanted there. And you can kind of starve them out with that and everything. I didn't see a lot of play of that. It's very hard to change the type of world I found. But that's what the terraforming directives will get you to. We'll talk about directives more very, very shortly. Okay, speaking of which, that's where we are. Now, for a lot of these functions, something good happens, you get an IP, an influence point. They're worth victory points, but can also be used as kind of a flexible cache. Cache can also be used as kind of a flexible cache. So cache can be used for technology on a one-for-one basis. It can buy you ships. It can buy you settlers. You're not allowed to exchange stuff with other players, though. Tech can only be used to buy tech. IPs can be turned into 2 tech each or $1 billion of cash each for building ships and settlers, or they can be held, and they can also they can buy you titles when titles come about, which is an optional. And finally, they're worth a half victory point each, whereas money and tech are worth a 1/10 of a victory point each. So holding onto your IPs is a very valuable thing, but if you really, really need that little extra buck or something, yeah, it might be worth paying for. Or if you really need some extra tech. All right, directives. Directives are a pile of counters, and you pull a couple of these at the beginning of the game. And each time you fulfill or discard a directive, and you pick one. And that is then your goal. And these are not trivial to do in general. Each player has a certain number of directives of different types based on their faction that they have to do. This can range from 2 for the givers, who can only do terraform directives, who are required to do terraform directives to avoid their penalty. You can take any directive you like. To the transhumanists, who can use any type to avoid their penalty, but they need to do 5 of them to avoid their penalty. So they have an exceptionally large penalty. Now, the penalty there, as written, is 15 points each, which means at the beginning of the game, the givers start at negative 30 points, and the transhumanists start at negative 75 points. The directives can be very difficult to do. Now, if you feel like they're too hard, you can spend an IP and get yourself 2 new directives to choose from. Did that a couple of times. But it's a painful thing because you might still end up getting shit. And hey, you just lost a half a victory point there. Or, a couple tech points or whatever. The penalties for the directives is too high, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, the designer agrees on that after looking at my scoring chart. But yeah, so, among many things that you might want to tweak in the game would be the directives. There's also titles. Now, titles are actually one of the things in this game that I really don't like the component for. I wish these were cards. Yeah, you can't find them. They're in here somewhere. I don't know where I got them. Anyway. They look like this. And there's a small quantity of them. 3 of them are fixed at the beginning of any grand campaign, and then 3 random ones are added as well. You have to meet a prerequisite, which is on the bottom of the counter. I wish it were on the top. My mind just works better that way. And then they give you an advantage, which is written on the top. What I found was the print on these was challenging for me. It's a little too small for something that you're constantly checking. Hey, can I meet this? Once you meet the prerequisite, you can then pay an IP cost to get them. And they have two things. They have their advantage, which is printed on the top, which again is printed so small it's kind of hard to go look at. Like the cards are easier to read and whatnot. And they give you 10 victory points, which is very nice. Again, my overall feeling was the complexities that this added. So, again, I really loved the original game. I really did. Even though I felt like it maybe lasted too long, I actually had the impression of, yeah, but I'd also like to play it again now that I've seen, how it works and gotten some better ideas of, strategies that I'd want to use, etc. I didn't feel like that at the end of this one. I felt like this one had outlasted its welcome, and I didn't immediately want to play again in the same sort of way. Now that may be because I played the original and then got to play this, and so I've gotten my 2 plays in, which is better than I do with most game systems. Well, I did really feel like there was the decision making. So the amount of clutter of game state was hard to analyze and see what was going on, but it was also really hard to make decisions in it. Even once I absorbed all the game state, I found the decision making process was getting too painful. There was way too much AP in there. I found that some of the new stuff that was added just didn't do that much for me. Most particularly the trade mechanism. I guess what I was hoping for was a different kind of, was some differences that it kind of explored more the difficulty of something that was one government or whatever holding together and operating together. I think a change of mindset could make that different. The factions aren't, like the nations in the original one. They're more kind of a whole civilization kind of forming out of humans, and as humans modify themselves, etc. And that they just have general, say, racial or whatever, factional disagreements, although, they're modifying themselves genetically, so it's more than that. That kind of, reflect a whole philosophy and everything, and not necessarily some command and control that's being exerted from Earth, where the ships are out there doing stuff. But I feel like there was an opportunity missed in terms of really exploring that kind of what is this faction? What's it about and everything? In a way, it felt too much like I had command and control in the same way that I did in the original. Now, in the original, I don't know what the distance of transmission is, but we can certainly use light speed transmission to get information in, a few minutes to anywhere in the solar system. So communications would really be instantaneous, and command and control would be very powerful. And fleets and whatnot could be sent out to deal with any problems that the governments would have within a reasonable amount of time, even at the slower speeds that were in the original. In this one, I wanted something that maybe was as innovative a take as that original was on sort of, it really hit the sweet spot for solar system exploration. This is using the same system and the same kind of play, and then the things that were added on, like trade, just didn't make a lot of sense to me. And I also kind of don't understand the titles, you know. They felt kind of painful. On top of that, there was the amount of clutter on the board, in my mind, spread out everywhere, that reduced the enjoyability of it to a degree that, like, I still had fun because I enjoy that core system. Maybe I wouldn't enjoy the kind of game that would have explored what is it like to try to maintain a civilization that's functionally different, you know, that's in competition of some sort with other factions and whatnot. What would it be like to maintain that kind of communications and coordination and bring the trade goods that are needed, etc.? None of that was really explored. And I don't know, some of me feels like an opportunity was missed, where I feel like a very, very clever mind towards designing these kind of games didn't really go in the direction I was hoping he would. So yeah, I mean, I just feel like the challenges of interstellar sublight communications and transportation wasn't really explored in a way that would have been such an interesting topic to see someone's take on. I don't have answers as to what that should look like, not by a long shot. I'm not good at coming up with those answers. I did muse on them a little bit as I was playing. But yeah, I mean, you would be seeing factions splitting apart and stuff like that, that I don't know if that would be, uh-oh, I got some beverages here. Does that mean this bag is open? I don't think so. It just feels to me like there's a missed opportunity to create something much, much more innovative than this was. Is that really a complaint against it? I don't know, but I had my hopes. Just like I had my hopes that it would expand from the play of the original game so that you could play one into the other. Although that actually also is a very, very difficult problem that I don't actually see the answer to. It takes up a huge footprint to play. Both of these games do. There are smaller scenarios or ways you can limit the size of that footprint. But I would definitely say get the first one first. If you really like that and you want to explore these differences between the two systems, yeah, sure, go for it. But I think the first one is a much stronger game. I also think it's a lot less cluttered. So like, it was much easier to handle and to deal with. And then, if you want a twist on it, yeah, this one's worth thinking about. I'm happy having it. Even with all my griping and everything, and I love to gripe. If you're used to me, you know that. And I love to kind of, posit other ideas and everything, but as it stands, it is still enough fun. It's another way for me to enjoy that same kind of play, but I think it's the lesser of the two entries, to be honest. All right, up it goes, I guess. All right, let's look at the different mechanisms as my toilet runneth. As to the play itself. First of all, I already talked about the sequence of play having some things that are simultaneous that aren't just mechanical aspects, in particular the developed tech. Everything else I think can work okay. The tracking of movement is done with these little, I can't remember the name of them, but they're number counters that get reduced. They indicate how many turns until you arrive at your destination. You can't change direction. You decide where you're going and you head there. I think there might have been a way to change direction in the original, where you can decide to bail from someplace. That's a big deal because changing direction, like you might look and say, oh, somebody's intercepting me, I ought to shy away from there. And you could probably see, whether there's a ship coming or not. Build and repair ships. So each player has a limited number of ships that they can have at any given time in the game, but and the quality of the ships is dependent on your tech tree, how big the ships are essentially. What I found with the ships as time went on was initially you had so much money, you bought what you could, you sent them out, and they went and did exploration stuff for the beginning of the game. At the end of the game, I started focusing more and more on colonizing. Now, maybe I should have focused more on it early on as well. It's kind of hard to get a grasp on how much the victory points are worth for various things without having played it. I think perhaps an early emphasis on colonization might actually be really good, but you also have a limit to how many systems you can have a base in. And I felt like exploring got me lots of cool stuff. It got me more tech and things like that. So spreading out as much as you can, exploring as much as you can, and just colonize. First of all, you can't colonize to begin with. But sending settlers out to start colonizing started to become such an expense late in the game that I found it hard to buy the big ships that could actually haul a lot of settlers and have the money for the settlers. Now, you have a lot of options in the game. So you could focus on producing money and producing settlers and all kind of stuff like that. And I'm not really sure what the optimal strategy is. Nothing is obvious in this game. The victory points are very difficult to discern who's doing how well. I guess you could calculate them at the end of, each 50 years or each century or something to get an idea of how well people are doing. But it's a lot of work to come up with the calculations, so I kind of didn't do that. And there's nothing intuitive that makes you just look and say, yeah, they're doing pretty well. Which means that if you don't do that kind of calculation, it's really hard to determine who's the bunny, who's in the lead, and to kind of target that person or hit them. And in fact, the guy who was, to me, obviously in last place, they ended up in third, and I'm not, people cut them some slack because they looked like they were in such bad shape. But it's really hard to make that decision there. Okay, how the rules are organized, let me touch on something else. So you got these blue sections, which are for the campaign game, right? But they show up in not the campaign game as well. So it's like you've got some rules, maybe they're in all the games, I'm not sure. Some of them certainly are, but some of them aren't. Like cargo transfer and trade, that may not be in some of the scenarios. So it's kind of weird. It's like some of the stuff for the campaign game in blue, in the blue background, shows up before the campaign game in scenarios. Some of the stuff that's in white doesn't show up in all the scenarios. So there's this weird sort of, how do you make your decision as to what color to make things? Anyway, you have multiple different kinds of combat you can do. Ship to ship, you can attack a base, you can attack a base with your own base, but then you don't get to include your ships in it. And then you can do something called raiding, which allows you to try to steal something from a base, but you might destroy it instead. And there's combat is kind of complicated. You add up your combat value, and you're going to resolve it on this chart for how many hits you generate. But then you get a modifier based on the size of the enemy you're shooting at. So the more the enemy has there, the more of a bonus you have for being able to hit them. Now, they also have more strength points probably because of that, but it's just sort of you get this weird sort of modifier, and you can get modifiers from other stuff as well. Now, damage is resolved kind of oddly in the sense that, like, the person receiving the damage, so you take the amount of points of damage that somebody's taking, and the person receiving it picks the first point, and then the person dealing it picks the second point on them, and they keep alternating. So it's not absolutely, like, quite often most games allow you to, like, say something along the lines of, the defender or the person receiving the damage chooses all the damage, or the person attacking gets to choose all the damage, or maybe there's edges that allow the attacker to make the choice instead of the defender or something like that. It's not like that here. But you're also not lining up ships and shooting them at each other, a la La Grande Guerre or something along those lines. So you're doing the combat on a single, basically, roll of the dice on here for each player, and then the damage is being allocated in a cooperative manner or antagonistic manner. I don't know. There's a cost for conducting combat, though. The person who attacked will get a penalty in these escalation markers, which are generally bad things, but not all. There's a fair proportion of good things, including victory points, that are just kicking around in them. The person who is being attacked gets a bonus in terms of influence points, which can be used to buy other stuff, basically. You can use them as tech, you can use them as money, you can use them to purchase titles if you're playing with that option. And the amount of points and escalation markers that each side receive are dependent on how much damage you do to the defender. And also, there's additional penalties for attacking someone in the Earth sector itself. It's a neat little mechanism. I like it. I don't remember it being in the original, but again, it's been a while since I played that. If this is an addition, it's one that I think is kind of cool, although because some of the escalation markers are good, it starts putting you in this weird position because you have a capability or a requirement to discard half your escalation markers at a certain time. A time which is not, it's here in the sequence. Okay, but it's not in the early part. So here's another thing with the rulebook. So, like, the economic phase is in the back of this rulebook. I think it only applies in the campaign game, but, like, these other campaign rules are kind of inserted in, so that may be kind of the difference between the two. In the economic phase, which I should have actually described first, there's a sequence of 7 different economic events, I guess. I don't know. And you shuffle them up, and you pick one. And then that one can't happen until the entire pile is done. And they each have different effects. One of those effects is to roll for new initiatives, and you discard half your escalation counters. Which may mean that although escalation counters are supposedly the penalty that you're paying for making an attack, you may want to take more escalation counters to protect the good ones that you're getting, which is kind of weird. Cargo transfer and trade, you're allowed to pick things up. This is one place where the rules are a little bit ambiguous, because I believe this is done in initiative order, but it claims you don't have to do dropping settlers off before you give trade goods away. The way the rules are written, I think you could drop settlers off, create a little trading colony, sell trade goods there, and then pick those settlers back up. That felt really ridiculous to me, so I was like, yeah, I don't want to do that. But I think the way they're specifically worded, you could probably do that. It felt like a silly thing. In my opinion, it felt like you should have to establish your trading colony and leave it there. But I guess it's a minor difference depending on how you want to do that. But yeah, the ordering is not well handled, and like I said, is it ambiguous? Maybe not. Maybe I just violated the rules and came up with my own rules there. Now the designer feels like a tinker from my interactions with him online, all public, but it seems like he's open to making new decisions and whatnot. That's a very cool thing. But it also opens things up to, wondering how much tinkering was going on late in the development of the game. And I get kind of a feeling that there might have been, some things, because, for example, he mentioned, the directives, the penalty for directives. I brought up that they feel like they're way too harsh. Kind of agreed with that. And I was kind of like, how much time did you get to play test that mechanism, But anyway, tinkering is how you find cool stuff, but it also is, it can be dangerous when it's taken too late into development. So the trade system itself, I do not like the trade system for this. And, he and I had a little back and forth about things that could be done to change it. I ended up playing with it as written, more or less. I may have fucked around with it a little bit, but you get demand markers at systems as they become colonized or once they're completely explored. And those demand markers, basically the mechanism is you draw two, pick one. But there are modifiers to that, some of which allow you to draw more based on different advantages you might have. Some of them allow you to keep more. It's possible, the way the rules are written, I think, for a big pile of demand markers to end up in a single location. When a demand marker is satisfied, when you bring the trade good to that demand marker, you end up getting cash for it. Nothing weird there. It's kind of like a pickup and delivery. Feels a little bit like, I don't know, Merchant of Venus. But Merchant of Venus, you can always sell goods at locations. They always want goods. It's an enhanced demand, which I kind of liked the feeling for. Here, you can't even deliver something unless there's a demand marker for it. And that feels a little weird because the demand markers can show up. First of all, they can show up and you instantly have the stuff. I don't really worry too much about that. That's just luck, right? But they can show up, and then communications, which should be limited to the speed of light until you have quantum communications capabilities, allow you to immediately start trying to deliver that good. And then something like medicine, or any of the demands really, you feel like, wow, you'd think they would like not wait that long. You know, but something like medicine is particularly, help, help, we have a plague. Yeah, we'll get you medicine whenever we're ready to. It could be like 50 years later. Uh-oh. I heard something, but it's not my camera, apparently. My camera's still going. All right. So yeah, there's something weird about that. And the actual production of trade goods, that happens in that economic phase, which doesn't seem surprising, but it happens on the flip of one particular tile. You get a fistful of trade goods based on, for the most part, who you are. And you only produce those trade goods if you have a location that can produce them. At the beginning, everybody's at Earth, so they have a very limited supply of things they can produce. Later on, you're able to produce things more, I don't know what to say, more broadly. You know, you're gonna find colonies in places. One of the things that's very hard is trying to figure out what you can produce where. The trade counters themselves are these little guys. There's no chart that indicates all the information that are on these. That would be actually really helpful in terms of components. So these guys would be presumably in a cup or a bag or something, and then in order to find out, you know, what you can produce, because you might have, well, first of all, you have demand markers, and you might be interested in trying to produce something to meet that demand. You have directives that sometimes tell you to produce a certain specific thing. It's not absolutely clear. You kind of have to hunt through the trade markers and find an example of the one, which might be on somebody else's stuff, to see where you can produce it and try to set up a colony to do that if that's your directive or something. So that's kind of a little bit painful. Actual movement's pretty easy. You have a movement multiplier, which comes off the tech tree, and different kinds of ships have different movement multipliers. There's some modifiers to it and all, but basically what it is that's the amount of turns it's going to take to travel a hex. And you count the number of hexes you want to go. You put one of these little, again, I don't remember the name of them, one of these little rotational number counters on it to be a countdown of how many turns it's going to take you to get there. Very similar system to the original Stellar Horizons, but the original one used a track instead of a number counter, and you end up decreasing. You know, each turn it decreases automatically. We skipped that, but it's no big deal. The actual exploration. So this is very similar to the original Stellar Horizons. You roll some dice. You see if you found anything. If you do, you get yourself a tech marker that aligns to the type of tech that the system has, like this is engineering here, and that would be a gray counter. If you pick a high enough counter, which depends on the number of players, honestly, and you might have multiple counters picked by a single ship under certain circumstances. After all exploration in that system is done, you end up decreasing. There's another marker, another little rotational marker of a different kind. Starts out as a 5, goes to this rotational side. You decrease that, and you're able to, you find a planet that way. And you draw a planet out of the planet box, and a bag, and end up putting it on the board. If all the planets are already filled, you might be able to replace a planet with a better one, but there are limitations on that. once you've explored the last number on this 1 through 5 counter here, there's no more exploration of that type, no more surveying allowed in the area. You get some advantages out of being the last person to do it. If you succeed in a survey, you make a check for an anomaly. Here I cheated. Like I said, anomalies, there was kind of an interesting effect to the cheating that I did, which was to put too many anomalies in a given system. It made some systems incredibly valuable and much more interesting to inhabit. The anomaly may prevent you from being able to further explore or build bases, and then somebody has to deal with it. And that can be done in a cooperative manner. These are done... So this is interesting. Exploration is done simultaneous initiative for surveys. What it doesn't say is what order you would resolve the anomalies in. Initiative seems like the obvious answer, so that's what I did. That cannot be simultaneous. And it also doesn't handle, you have a capability to do those cooperatively. It doesn't handle what happens if, like, one person is ahead in the initiative, a second person is in between but could handle the whole thing, and a third person is behind both of them but would be needed for the first person. So there's, some slight areas where the rules need some clarification. I'm going to swap batteries and I'll be back. All right, let's finally get to the review for Andrew Rader's Stellar Horizons 2. It's part of the title, so we put the name in there, right? Okay. So that was a longer game than I expected, and the videos were much longer than I expected, but that's because there's a Euro-type nature to the game, which I can't say I'm incredibly fond of, but what it does is it kind of obscures the narrative and what's going on. You end up, because of the interleaving and the pulsing, same way CDGs and a lot of more modern designs do, it ended up being a lot more intense about the at-the-moment play. Start off with, I really loved the first one, Stellar Horizons. Also in the same kind of big box. The topic of, like, leaving Earth and beginning to explore is one that really, really appeals to me. I can think of a couple of games that I have that deal with that subject as opposed to, the more traditional 4X type space game, going back to things like Stellar Conquest and stuff along those lines. Unlike Stellar Horizons, the original, this one covers, you can look at the whole map when I have it set up in some of the playthroughs, but this one covers basically the near areas of the galaxy and stars that are likely to have useful planets around them. So, yeah, I mean, other things that I've played of this nature in terms of the topic, I played High Frontier a few times, and I played, I think it's called Space Corps, the GMT game. And I was kind of hoping for something kind of like both of those, right? So in High Frontier, if you play with the full expansions, you can start exploring outside the solar system. It just gives you a slice of that. And Stellar Horizons the original kind of gives you some of that too, with the deep space astronomy and stuff like that. where I believe you're able to start to hit sort of that high frontier line of things. Space Core really didn't appeal to me. I had a lot of fun with the early parts of the game, but then it started getting too busy and too divorced from any kind of narrative. Strangely enough, this one does too, but in a different sort of way. I was really disappointed, although I did buy an expansion for it. Maybe I'll get to that at some point. But that game started, the thinking started getting too complex for what the game was. It really felt very Euro. This one feels sort of like a hybrid, right? Something between a more traditional space exploration type game and the Euro type mechanisms that it does include. And you can, well, I really loved the first Stellar Horizons, although I do have to say both this and that one suffer from the same kind of feeling of, it's kind of feeling like it's staying too long. It's a little too long of a game for what it is. Not by much, not by much. Although the complexity that this one started to get to at the end, the decisions were just becoming way too painful. Probably more painful than they are in Space Core. However, there was enough to attract me to this that I was more willing to cope with that pain, but it was getting to the point where it was getting towards my breaking point. Now, when I played, I definitely made some mistakes. I made a mistake, a big one in setup to begin with, where you're actually supposed to start at a more accelerated position than I did. That might have affected things a little bit. And I also had this strange inability, and we'll get to that when we get to components, but to internalize a rule, which is that the anomalies, apparently, you're limited to one per star system. And you can find other anomalies, but only the special effects of the anomalies and having to deal with them and everything. It's one per star system. So I actually ran out of anomalies, which shouldn't have happened. Somebody pointed me to the rule, and I'm like, first of all, I think the designer pointed out that I was missing that factor, and I don't know if I ignored it or whatever. And I don't think I intentionally did so. Obviously, I ignored it. And then somebody towards the end of the game, when I was complaining that my anomalies had run out, came back with, I think you were told this. I tried to look for it in the rules, which I think I felt was the case. I'm not really sure I did. It feels like something that, it felt like it was wrong. It felt like one per space felt right. And it's right there early on in the rules, but I had a lot of trouble with these rules, and we'll get to that in more detail in a little bit. The game overall, so that you don't have to watch this whole thing, which, knowing me, is probably going to be way too long, is very similar to the original Stellar Horizons, which, again, I loved enough that I wanted this, right? But one thing that I was hoping for, and I don't know, where I got led to this or whatever, was that it would be something I could play after a game of Stellar Horizons. Yeah, to make a game that's twice as long or longer, where one led into the other, where the explorations and whatnot of the solar system would allow you to expand then into much the same way that High Frontier kind of does, and that much more Space Core does. It doesn't. One of two disappointments of that type. The next one's coming soon, which is a game that I thought, by its title, would run me through the entirety of the Napoleonic Wars. Yeah, it doesn't, but we'll get to that when we start playing that thing. If I can convince myself, I couldn't convince myself to reread the rules, even though I kind of finished the rules early on in this. Yeah, so that was a major disappointment when I realized I couldn't link the two games. But on the other hand, the factions in this are very different. The scope of the game is different. And there's a lot of, I don't know, there's a lot that just feels very, very different. It's not, the original Stellar Horizons worked on nationalities. This works on these all Earthlings, but different kind of factions that have different goals in terms of, why they're exploring and what their aims are, etc. Yeah. I suppose we should hit components. But in many ways, I just want to say, some of the systems are the systems that come from the original Stellar Horizons. This is sort of an expansion of that, and one of the things that really disappointed me was, well, there were a few things that disappointed me about this in comparison. Now, if this were the only game, if this had been the first game, and the other one didn't exist, I probably would have rated this about a point higher. I rated this at about a 6. But part of that is because it's just not as good as the original for me, for my tastes. And some of the reasons it's not as good, one, the science in the original Stellar Horizons was all absolutely believable, right? It was not far out there. It was similar to High Frontier in that, yeah, these things could all be done, right? And it felt like, to me, a more military, although not exceedingly militarily focused, version of that High Frontier narrative that was going on. One where you have the same kind of nation states and whatnot working with their own edges and abilities. Both games have the same kind of ships in them, which is basically each faction or nation or whatever has its own set of ships that reflect their own philosophy. I realized as I was putting this away that it's very similar to WIF, which makes some sense there, World in Flames, because Raider has been heavily involved in the WIF community, and in fact, something I've got to get to at some point soon before I expire, which is the Fatal Alliances that I picked up. I really want to take a look at that. I never got to play the original overlay version of it, and I guess he reworked it. And I've always thought that World in Flames felt kind of World War I-ish in a lot of ways that, say, a World at War doesn't. And I'm really intrigued to see how the game plays out, handling, using WIF-like structures to handle World War I. So, I guess, yeah, I didn't get to my points here. How like me. So in this one, there are a few things that feel like they are stretches in terms of the technology. The quantum communications as a concept, yeah, that's getting pretty far out there. It's believable, but mainly one of the things was there's the possibility, unless you do a lot of hand waving and pretend it's not there. Well, no. There's, at certain levels of tech, your movement speeds are going to be higher than the speed of light, which is somewhat disturbing. There are things like wormhole technologies that aren't on the tech tree, that are on cards. They don't have a lot of effect on play. I don't think I use them very, very lightly. And yeah, and that's one of the aspects that I didn't like about it. It didn't feel quite as grounded in, the science that we understand now, right? Could it be believable that ships could be able to pass the light barrier somehow? Yeah, probably not. In fact, I would say any kind of instant acceleration to close to light speed, which would allow you to get to distances that even get you close to the distances in the game don't really allow for I don't know how to put this. The speeds in the game are such that at the higher techs, not the very highest techs where you can actually exceed light speed in some cases, you're still like at almost instantaneous acceleration. And that feels a little wrong. To me, it feels like the speeds should all be a little lower than they are. A quibbling point, right? Much more problematic for me was the amount of game state that's exposed in this. It's much more complex than the original Stellar Horizons in terms of how much you have to take in. I felt the original was about maybe my sweet spot, maybe a little above. This one was getting to the point where it was just too much for me to cope with. Lots of revealed information each. And some of that would be easier if I wasn't playing solo. There's no question of that. But there was a lot you have to keep track of. In order to make good decisions, you have to be aware of all your enemies and their potential opponents, perhaps, and their potential capabilities to reach a certain star system and whatnot. So you have to be aware of a number of different places on the board. That was very difficult. Another was the amount of clutter on the board. These hexes aren't very big. Lots of ships would go into a single location, although some of that was the large number of anomalies issue, or having too many anomalies in one system, which made the system more attractive. That was actually an interesting factor. That mistake created some neat dynamics, which made certain systems more attractive than they should have been, whereas otherwise there would be a lot of kind of moderately attractive systems. The original had tracks for the movement. It took up a lot of space. This one does too, in terms of a huge footprint on the table, but there weren't a lot of places in the game where the board felt overcrowded. Here, there were regularly places that felt overcrowded in terms of the amount of ships going into a certain system, and just the same amount of ships could be going into a planet in the original, and because of how they were tracked on that, it just was less clutter. So that was a big factor. There was one other. The things that kind of expanded or changed from the first game to this one, many of them I felt were less well designed in some ways. They created more clutter, either mental clutter or actual physical board clutter, and increased the amount of game state that's just present in all kind of cards and information that's all over the place. So, yeah, I found myself being a little bit more taxed than I want to be, as well as having some little gripes about it. I also felt like the trade system in this I had to look at the original to see what it didn't have, etc. There was a trade system in the original. It was very much based on the kinds of materials you would be dealing in as you're exploring the solar system, whereas this one was trying to extend it to more of I don't know what to call it, because it was adding a sort of a pickup and delivery aspect to it, but it was less less predictable what your trade situation could be, and you didn't end up with like, steady trade routes. I think you did in the original, where you could pick up fuel somewhere and haul it somewhere else, and it was useful in that fashion or whatever. I don't remember a hell of a lot about the original. I remember really getting a kick out of that, and it feels like the changes between the two, but much of it was the same. The whole exploration mechanism with these little counters that indicate how many times you can explore successfully in an area in order to get more information about the system, etc. That's the same, and I really liked that. Yeah, let me go into some of the components then. Money in the original was little chips, little counters. Here it was done with paper money, very, very glossy, thin quality stuff. I don't know. It was sufficient, but not pleasant, and I might well replace it with chips at some point or another. The cards, of course, cards these days are just wonderful, right? It's so easy to put cards in a game that are, high quality, and the printing capabilities and whatnot are really, really advantageous for that. Here the cards reflect sort of individual advances that you can get that, for the most part, other people can't. There might be 2 copies of a given card in the deck, and they formed basically 6 little decks of advancements that went towards fleet capabilities or genetic capabilities, so that your faction starts becoming, especially in terms of genetic stuff, very different from the other factions. One issue with these, there aren't a hell of a lot of them. So in the big 7-player game going the campaign, you're likely to run out of them. There's a number of issues that depend on the number of players, right? The game takes on a different flavor when you're playing with the full quantity of players than it does in terms of than it would if you're playing, say, just like maybe a 4-player game or even a solo game. The game handles solo fine. Not the way I played it. I mean, a true solo game where you're just out exploring and seeing what you got. Each player has their own little faction card, which gives some information that's important in the game, but it also gives faction advantages. This is part of the game state that's hard to remember. The faction advantages, as well as how much tech they produce on Earth and what their ship maximums and everything are. Each one is to reflect the philosophy of that particular faction. No problem with it in and of itself, but remember, there's this game state issue, right? There's these, there's the cards, there's a lot of crap on the board. There is a big old tech board. So the cards aren't the only place where there's tech. There's a tech tree. You pretty much fill this sucker out over the course of the grand campaign. In fact, you're penalized for each tech on here that you don't have. So that's sort of the basic tech that you should get. Some of it feels less than, like some of the card stuff feels like it should be just as available as some of the stuff on there. I'm not sure how I feel about that combination of two, but again, it's creating a lot of different state in different places you have to look. You have to look at the tech chart, which might be easier to record on a piece of paper in a lot of ways. You have to look at your special abilities. You have to look at your cards. If you're playing with the optional rules, your titles, and your directives all generate more state that you have to be paying attention to and trying to see what you can do. Titles can give you advantages. They also give you goals. Directives give you goals that when you achieve them, they give you victory points. You have to be paying attention to all the damn anomalies that are out there. and what you can, what you can achieve with them and what the advantages are. It was very, very difficult with all that game state to make any kind of decision as to who's winning the game. I was very surprised at the end with the things that I found out. First of all, I thought everybody was doing about the same except for one player who was clearly behind everyone else as far as I could see. And then when I counted up the score, that player who I thought was clearly in last place because of how badly they had been mauled, ended up in like third place. So there's some interesting mechanisms in play that allow you to score well even if you don't have a lot of board presence. Yeah. All kinds of counters. I mean, just tons of stuff to track the different factions, to track trade goods, to track demand on trade, all the different planets, anomalies, event chits, which don't come out very often. There's a lot of stuff here, and it all kind of comes into play, which is part of why there's so much game state in play. I did find the little tech things that towards the end of the 7-player game, this was something that ran out. And people who had technologies, who were saving up for the expensive technologies, if enough people are saving up for expensive technologies, these start ending up in the hands of players and they become not available. One thing I wanted to point out was the amount of extraneous stuff you need. I needed 4 containers of this type, plus 2 of these, one much larger bag to draw things from. And even with that, I did not have enough to cover everything. I think I would have needed, with all the optionals and everything, another 2 or 3 bags to handle everything. But there's to some extent, you can pull everything out of a bag and throw things in and reshuffle or whatever. But I found myself needing a lot of little containers of some sort or another, and some of them really couldn't have gone with a little cup like this. The bags were much more effective there. Like I said, huge footprint on the game as a whole. Final thing I want to get to in components before I start talking is what about the paper stuff? Got a couple of player aids. Would have been helpful to have more of these. Doesn't matter for me, but in an opposed game, 2 feels like too few. But of course you could photocopy these, put them, there's no indication that you can. No, you're clear to photocopy these, but look, you could do it. One thing, these guys were misprinted, and they caught it before shipping and sent a little thing and sent some replacement counters that made that easier. On a negative note about that, the reprints are facing the other way, which means the convex concave side of the counters was switched from the original. It's not a big deal, but it is one of those little things that kind of irks me a little bit. But what about the rulebook itself? The rulebook itself is weird. So you grab the rulebook and you grab the player's guide, and the player's guide says, new players read this booklet first. Well, the player guide is basically the first few pages of the rulebook, giving you the components and what they do, but then hitting some examples of play, which just felt like a really weird structure to me. Like, the first few pages of it felt like the first few pages of the rulebook, and then the last couple pages felt like stuff that should be at the end of the rule book after you read it. Felt very weird to me. I know I struggled with the rule book and this structure. I also struggled with how sparsely written the rules were. There were a couple of places where I felt like I had to make some interpretations on them. For the most part, they were correct, though. You know, nothing too, nothing that was directly contradictory, although the sequence of play indicates some things have to be done in initiative order or reverse initiative order, and some things can be done simultaneous, but I felt like some of the things that could be done simultaneous would be a real problem if they were played simultaneously. Simultaneous placement is kind of problematic in a game played, you know, multi-faction, solo, etc. So I usually create mechanisms for that kind of stuff. If you want to see one, take a look at, say, my Civilization videos, or what's another one that does? Pax Britannica is probably the most cursed of all, which has a very similar structure to this, where if people are allowed to play the way the rules are written, you will have everybody withholding doing anything to see what somebody else does, which is, I can see that happening, and it's not like you're on your own board doing stuff that doesn't influence other people. You're actually doing things that your movement or whatever that, movement isn't such an example. That's a bad choice. But your choice of building ships, I believe that was allowed to be done simultaneously. Buying tech is allowed to be done simultaneously. These things don't really, I don't know, building ships is initiative order, movements, or reverse initiative. Movements, reverse initiative. Exploration is simultaneous. Can that be? Yeah, I think more or less. There's a little bit of weirdness about the ordering within. I think the biggest one was buying tech, where you would want to see what other people did. And that creates a sort of a weird situation, but anyway. There's some stuff that's only really easily accessible off of this card. For example, the influence, what you get influence points for and what you can do with them is summarized here. There's no similar place in the rule book. So again, the fact that there's only 2 of these is kind of iffy. I talked about that initial, that player's guide or whatever, which felt so weird. Go look at the player's guide, which, you know, again, some of it's stuff that you just expect at the beginning, and then others is like how stuff works, but not the actual rules on it, more an example on it. That structure and the fact that some of the scenario rules, I felt a little confused about the setup for some of the scenarios, etc. I feel like that caused them to produce this scenario guide, a further set including more detailed play example of one of the scenarios. The scenarios themselves in this play out as, it felt like at first they were kind of an introductory, add different rules to the game, sort of like programmed instruction in something like Magic Realm or something. But then they actually added, so some of the scenarios are kind of not on the main campaign game line of existence. So like there's things that are just very, very different in terms of how they play. And in terms of some of the mechanisms, they have different kinds of mechanisms there. I tried to avoid those for the most part. I did a couple of the introductory scenarios and then kept looking, and I'm like, well, this doesn't actually match the main game. So it's basically, you can have some smaller little scenarios that aren't just a short version of the game, but that give you very, very different kinds of play. And that's kind of cool in that you got this box of a lot of components and stuff, and here are some new ways, some different things you can do with these components, different kinds of games that you can play with them. I thought that was kind of cool, but it also wasn't very attractive to me. I wanted to get to the campaign game. This is the player aid is reproduced in here as well. Let me check my time because I'm sure I'm going to hit multiple in here. Yeah, we got to swap.